The morning fog clung to Millbrook Station like a shroud, swirling around the lone figure sitting on the wooden bench. Clara's wedding dress, once pristine white silk, now bore the stains of tears and the dust of abandonment. Her suitcase sat beside her, a cruel reminder of dreams that had crumbled in the span of a single telegram. The 6:15 train had come and gone hours ago, taking with it her last chance at the life she thought she was meant to live. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Clara May Henderson had always known silence in ways most people never would. Born deaf in the small town of Cedar Falls, Minnesota, she had learned to read the world through eyes that caught every gesture, every facial expression, every subtle shift in body language that hearing people missed. Her parents, Samuel and Margaret Henderson, had done their best to raise her with love, but in 1887, options for deaf children were limited and understanding even more scarce. The Henderson farm had been Clara's entire world for 23 years. She helped her mother with the household duties, tended to the chickens, and spent countless hours in their small garden, finding peace among the tomatoes and corn that grew in neat rows behind their modest farmhouse. Her father, a man of few words even when spoken aloud, had learned basic hand signs to communicate with his daughter, though their conversations remained simple and functional. Clara's education had come from her mother's patient teachings and the worn books in their parlor. Margaret Henderson had been a schoolteacher before marriage, and she made sure Clara could read and write with exceptional skill. While other young women in town gathered for social events Clara couldn't fully participate in, she found solace in the written word and the intricate needlework that occupied her hands during long winter evenings. The isolation hadn't been entirely unwelcome. Clara had grown accustomed to observing life from the periphery, watching the social dances of her peers without the pressure to join in. She noticed things others missed. The way Mrs. Patterson's smile never reached her eyes when she spoke of her marriage, how young Thomas Miller's shoulders sagged whenever his father appeared, the careful distance the preacher's wife maintained from her husband during Sunday services. When the letter arrived from her cousin Rebecca in Pennsylvania, Clara's quiet world shifted on its axis. Rebecca, 2 years her senior, had married well and settled in the bustling town of Millbrook. Her husband owned a successful grain mill, and their social circle included several eligible bachelors. Among them was Jonathan Whitmore, a banker's son who had recently returned from university in Philadelphia. Rebecca's letters painted Jonathan as cultured and kind, a man who had traveled to Europe and spoke 3 languages. Most importantly, Rebecca assured Clara, he was specifically interested in meeting a woman who valued quiet contemplation over endless chatter. Rebecca had shared Clara's photograph and letters, carefully written in Clara's elegant script, and Jonathan had expressed genuine interest in correspondence. The exchange of letters between Clara and Jonathan had begun tentatively that autumn. His handwriting was refined, his thoughts expressed with the precision of an educated man. He wrote of literature and philosophy, of his travels through France and Italy, of his desire to find a partner who appreciated the finer things in life. Clara found herself enchanted by his descriptions of opera houses and art galleries, worlds she had only imagined through books. Jonathan's letters gradually became more personal. He confessed his own sense of isolation despite being surrounded by society, his feeling that most people engaged in meaningless conversation while avoiding genuine connection. He admired Clara's thoughtful responses to his philosophical questions and praised her insights into the novels they both read. When he wrote that he found her silence intriguing rather than limiting, Clara felt something she had never experienced before: hope. The proposal came in February, delivered in Jonathan's careful script on cream-colored paper. He wrote of his desire to provide for her, to share his life with someone who understood the value of quiet moments and deep thoughts. He promised to learn to communicate with her properly and spoke of their future together in Millbrook, where she would want for nothing. The ring he sent was modest but elegant, a simple gold band with a small pearl that caught the light from her bedroom window. Clara's parents had been cautiously optimistic. Samuel Henderson had grown increasingly worried about his daughter's future as he aged, knowing that their small farm could barely support them, let alone provide security for Clara after they were gone. Margaret had seen the joy in her daughter's eyes when Jonathan's letters arrived and couldn't bring herself to discourage what might be Clara's only chance at marriage and independence. The wedding dress had been Margaret's own, carefully altered to fit Clara's smaller frame. They had worked together for weeks, adjusting the sleeves and hem, adding new pearl buttons and fresh lace trim. Margaret had brushed Clara's long brown hair until it shone, braiding it with ribbon and securing it beneath the delicate veil that had belonged to Clara's grandmother. The journey to Millbrook had taken 2 days by train, with Clara traveling alone for the first time in her life. She carried a letter of introduction from Rebecca, detailed directions to the church where the ceremony would take place, and enough money for a return ticket should anything go wrong. The possibility that something might go wrong seemed remote as she watched the countryside roll past her window, imagining the life that awaited her with Jonathan. She had arrived in Millbrook on Thursday evening, 3 days before the planned Saturday wedding ceremony. Rebecca had arranged for her to stay at the Millbrook Inn, a respectable establishment near the train station. The innkeeper, Mrs. Dorothy Walsh, had been expecting her and showed Clara to a small but clean room on the second floor. Rebecca had planned to collect her the following morning to introduce her to Jonathan and finalize the wedding preparations. Friday morning had dawned bright and clear, and Clara had dressed carefully in her traveling dress, the deep blue wool that complemented her dark eyes. She waited in the inn's modest lobby, watching through the window for Rebecca's carriage. When the clock struck 10 and then 11, with no sign of her cousin, Clara began to feel the first stirrings of unease. Mrs. Walsh noticed Clara checking her pocket watch repeatedly and approached with a concerned expression. Through gestures and written notes, Clara explained that she was waiting for her cousin. Mrs. Walsh nodded sympathetically and assured her that delays were common, suggesting Clara take a walk around town to pass the time. Millbrook was larger than Cedar Falls, with proper sidewalks and gas streetlights, shops with large windows displaying the latest fashions from Philadelphia and New York. Clara wandered the main street, observing the bustle of commerce and social interaction she had never experienced in her small farming community. The people seemed prosperous and purposeful, the women's dresses more elaborate than anything she had seen, the men's suits cut with obvious care and expense. When she returned to the inn that afternoon, Mrs. Walsh handed her an envelope that had been delivered in her absence. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she opened it, recognizing Rebecca's familiar handwriting. The letter was brief and devastating in its simplicity. Rebecca wrote that there had been a terrible misunderstanding. Jonathan's family had only recently learned of Clara's deafness, information that Rebecca had assumed would not matter given Jonathan's previous correspondence. The Whitmore family had been horrified to discover that their son intended to marry a woman they considered damaged and unsuitable for their social position. Jonathan's father had threatened to disown him and remove him from the bank if he proceeded with the marriage. Jonathan himself, Rebecca continued, had been torn between his feelings for Clara and his family's demands. In the end, the pressure had proven too much. He had left Millbrook the previous evening, taking a position with a bank in Chicago that his father had arranged. He sent his regrets and hoped Clara would understand that circumstances beyond his control had made their marriage impossible. Rebecca's own position had become untenable as well. Her husband, pressured by his business associates, who included the Whitmore family, had forbidden her from having any further contact with Clara. Rebecca expressed her sorrow and included enough money for Clara's return journey to Minnesota, along with additional funds for her immediate needs. Clara had read the letter 3 times before its full meaning settled in her mind. The man who had written so eloquently about the value of true communication had chosen societal expectations over personal connection. The family who had never met her had decided her worth based on a single aspect of her being. The cousin who had arranged this entire venture was now abandoning her to preserve her own social standing. The rest of Friday and all of Saturday had passed in a blur of shock and humiliation. Clara remained in her room at the inn, too stunned to eat or sleep properly. Mrs. Walsh checked on her periodically, offering silent comfort and small meals that Clara barely touched. The wedding dress hung in the wardrobe like a ghost of dreams. Deferred. By Sunday morning, Clara had made her decision. She would not return immediately to Cedar Falls and her parents' inevitable questions and pitying looks. She needed time to understand what had happened and what it meant for her future. The money Rebecca had sent would allow her to stay in Millbrook for several weeks if she was careful with her expenses. She had risen early that Sunday morning, dressed in her traveling clothes, and made her way to the train station. Not to board a train, but to sit and think in the place where her journey had begun, where she now found herself stranded between her past and an uncertain future. The morning fog had rolled in from the surrounding hills, creating a cocoon of grey silence that matched her internal state. Clara sat on that bench for hours, watching trains arrive and depart, passengers hurrying to their destinations with purpose and certainty she envied. Her suitcase contained all her worldly possessions, a few changes of clothes, the books she treasured, letters from Jonathan that now seemed like cruel fiction, and the wedding dress that would never serve its intended purpose. The depot slowly filled with the usual Sunday travelers, families returning from visits, merchants heading to neighboring towns for the week's business. Clara observed them all with the keen attention her deafness had trained her to maintain, reading their stories in their posture and expressions while remaining invisible in her own solitude. As the morning wore on and the fog began to lift, Clara found herself noticing patterns in the depot's rhythm. The 8:30 train brought mostly workers returning from weekend visits to family. The 10:15 carried families dressed in their Sunday best, likely heading to visit relatives in surrounding towns. The 11:45 seemed to attract a mix of business travelers and young people seeking adventure in bigger cities. It was while watching the 11:45 departure that Clara first noticed him. A tall man in work clothes, standing near the platform's edge, watching the train disappear into the distance with an expression of profound longing. His clothes marked him as a farmer or laborer, clean but clearly worn from honest work. His hair was the color of wheat ready for harvest, and his hands, even at a distance, showed the calluses and strength that came from years of physical labor. What struck Clara most was the way he watched that train. There was a yearning in his stance, a desire for something beyond his current circumstances that she recognized because she felt it herself. He stood there for several minutes after the train disappeared, his shoulders set in resignation before he turned and walked back toward town. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Clara found herself curious about this solitary figure. In her observation of people, she had become skilled at reading the stories written in body language and facial expressions. This man carried himself with the same careful distance from the world that she recognized in herself, the posture of someone accustomed to watching life rather than fully participating in it. The afternoon brought fewer travelers, and Clara remained. On her bench, uncertain about her next move but reluctant to return to the inn and face Mrs. Walsh's concerned questions. The sun had begun to cast longer shadows across the platform when she saw him again. The same man who had watched the morning train with such longing. This time, he wasn't watching trains. He was watching her. Thomas Mitchell had been coming to Millbrook Station for 3 months. Though he'd never actually boarded a train, every Sunday after church he would walk the 2 miles from his farm on the outskirts of town, stand on that platform, and watch the 11:45 depart for Philadelphia. He told himself it was just a walk, just a way to fill the empty hours that stretched endlessly through his weekends. The truth was more complicated. At 31, Thomas had inherited his father's farm 5 years earlier, along with the crushing loneliness that seemed to come with the property. The 160 acres of fertile land provided him with a decent living, but the farmhouse felt cavernous with only his presence to fill it. His neighbors were friendly enough, but most were family men whose conversations inevitably turned to wives and children, topics that only emphasized Thomas's isolation. He had tried courting local women, attending church socials and community gatherings with the awkward persistence of a man who understood duty better than desire. Sarah Jenkins had entertained his attention for several months before choosing the blacksmith's son, a man who could make her laugh with easy confidence Thomas had never possessed. Mary Catherine O'Sullivan had accepted his invitation to 2 dinners before gently explaining that she didn't feel they were well suited, her kind eyes unable to hide the pity that stung worse than outright rejection. The problem, Thomas knew, wasn't his appearance or his prospects. He owned his land outright, kept his accounts balanced, and maintained his property with the methodical care his father had taught him. The problem was his inability to fill silence with the kind of comfortable chatter that seemed to come naturally to other men. In groups, Thomas found himself listening rather than speaking, observing rather than participating, present in body but somehow absent in spirit. His parents had been different. Robert and Helen Mitchell had filled their farmhouse with music and laughter, his father's booming voice carrying across the fields, his mother's gentle humming floating from the kitchen as she worked. They had been partners in every sense, completing each other's sentences and sharing looks that conveyed entire conversations. Their sudden death in a carriage accident had left Thomas not just orphaned, but bereft of his only examples of how love was supposed to work. The weekly trips to the train station had begun as practical errands, checking on freight deliveries and grain shipments, but Thomas found himself drawn to the platform even when he had no business there, watching strangers begin journeys he would never make, departing for lives more interesting than his own. The 11:45 to Philadelphia represented everything his life lacked: movement, possibility, the chance to become someone different in a place where no one knew his history of social failures. This particular Sunday, however, the station held something different. The woman on the bench had been there when he arrived at his usual time, and she remained when the 11:45 pulled away without her. Her posture spoke of defeat in a language Thomas recognized intimately. She sat with the careful stillness of someone trying to make herself invisible, her dark blue dress modest but well made, her luggage suggesting a journey that had either been postponed or abandoned. Thomas had learned to read people's silences, perhaps because he was so often silent himself. This woman's silence felt different from his own, less chosen than imposed. She didn't fidget or check her pocket watch like other waiting passengers. Instead, she watched the platform with intense attention, her eyes tracking movement and faces with an alertness that suggested she was gathering information other people missed. When their eyes finally met across the platform, Thomas felt an unexpected jolt of recognition. Not that he knew her, but that he understood something fundamental about her solitude. She didn't look away immediately as most people did when caught staring. Instead, she held his gaze for a moment, and in that brief connection, Thomas sensed a depth of isolation that matched his own. He approached slowly, uncertain of his welcome but drawn by an impulse he couldn't name. As he drew closer, he noticed details that confirmed his initial impression. Her clothes were travel-worn but carefully maintained. Her hair was neatly arranged despite obvious fatigue, and her hands were folded in her lap with the composed stillness of someone accustomed to waiting. When he stopped a respectful distance from her bench, Thomas struggled with how to begin a conversation. His usual awkwardness with strangers was complicated by an intuition that this situation required more delicacy than his limited social skills typically provided. He cleared his throat softly and offered what he hoped was a reassuring smile. "Excuse me, miss," he said, his voice carrying the slight hoarseness of someone unaccustomed to speaking to strangers. "I couldn't help but notice you've been waiting here for quite some time. Is there anything I might help you with?" The woman's response surprised him. Instead of answering immediately, she studied his face with careful attention, her eyes moving from his mouth to his eyes and back again. Then she reached into her small purse and withdrew a piece of paper and pencil, writing something quickly before showing it to him. "I'm deaf," the note read in elegant script. "Thank you for your kindness, but I am simply thinking." Thomas stared at the note for a moment, processing this information. He had encountered deaf people before, though rarely, and his experience was limited to awkward exchanges involving shouting and exaggerated gestures that usually ended in mutual frustration. This woman's calm directness was something different. Entirely, he took the pencil she offered and wrote his own response. "I am Thomas Mitchell. I come here often to think as well. Would you mind if I sat with you? Sometimes thinking is easier with company." She read his note, and something shifted in her expression, a subtle relaxation that suggested his words had found their mark. She gestured to the empty space on the bench beside her, and Thomas sat down, maintaining a respectful distance while trying to ignore the way her presence affected his usually steady nerves. For several minutes, they sat in comfortable silence, both watching the afternoon activities of the depot. Thomas found himself oddly at peace, freed from the pressure to make conversation or fill awkward pauses. This woman seemed to understand that silence could be companionable rather than uncomfortable, a revelation that felt profound to someone who had always struggled with the social expectation of constant chatter. When she reached for her paper again, Thomas felt a flutter of anticipation. "My name is Clara Henderson," she wrote. "I came here for a wedding that will not happen. I find myself uncertain about what comes next." Thomas read her words twice, struck by their simple honesty. Most people, he reflected, would have hidden behind polite fictions or elaborate explanations. Clara's directness was refreshing in its absence of social performance. "I am sorry to hear about your disappointment," he wrote back. "Are you from Millbrook originally?" "Minnesota," she replied in writing. "I've never been this far from home before. Everything here seems larger and more complicated than what I'm used to." Thomas understood that feeling intimately. Though he had lived in Pennsylvania his entire life, he often felt lost in social situations that others navigated with apparent ease. "I have lived here all my life," he wrote, "but I often feel like a stranger in familiar places. Perhaps we are both outsiders in different ways." Clara looked up from his note to study his face again, and Thomas had the distinct impression she was seeing something in his expression that most people missed. When she smiled, it was the first genuine warmth he had witnessed from her, and it transformed her features from merely pretty to genuinely beautiful. "You are very kind to sit with a stranger," she wrote. "Most people become uncomfortable when they discover I cannot hear them. I find your silence peaceful," Thomas replied honestly. "I have never been skilled at conversation myself. Perhaps that is why your company feels natural to me." As the afternoon wore on, Their written conversation continued with surprising ease. Clara told him about her family's farm in Minnesota, her love of reading, and her skill with needlework. Thomas shared details about his own farming life, his struggles with loneliness, and his weekly visits to the station. Neither probed too deeply into the other's disappointments, but both seemed to understand that they had found something unexpected in each other's company. When the shadows began to grow longer and the depot prepared to close for the evening, Thomas realized he didn't want this encounter to end. Clara seemed to sense his reluctance as well, gathering her belongings slowly, as if postponing an inevitable separation. "Where are you staying?" Thomas wrote, then immediately worried that his question might seem forward or inappropriate. "The Millbrook Inn," Clara replied. "Mrs. Walsh has been very kind to me." Thomas knew Mrs. Walsh by reputation, a decent woman who ran a respectable establishment. That Clara was staying there spoke well of her character and circumstances, though he suspected her extended stay might be straining her resources. "Would you allow me to escort you back to the inn?" he wrote. "It will be dark soon, and I would feel better knowing you arrived safely." Clara nodded her acceptance, and they gathered her luggage together. As they walked the few blocks to the inn, Thomas found himself acutely aware of her presence beside him. She moved with quiet grace, her attention focused on their surroundings. With the same intense observation he had noticed at the depot, at the inn's entrance, they paused awkwardly, both seeming reluctant to end their time together. Thomas pulled out the paper they had been sharing and wrote one final message. "Would you be willing to meet me again tomorrow? I would like to continue our conversation." Clara's response was immediate. "I would like that very much." Monday morning arrived with an unseasonable warmth that drew Clara from her room at the inn earlier than usual. She had slept better than she had since arriving in Millbrook, her dreams free from the anxiety that had plagued her since Rebecca's devastating letter. Something about her encounter with Thomas Mitchell had shifted the weight of her circumstances, transforming her abandonment from a source of shame into merely another chapter in a story that was still being written. Mrs. Walsh noticed the change immediately when Clara descended to the small dining room for breakfast. The older woman's eyebrows raised slightly at Clara's improved appearance, her hair carefully arranged and her dress pressed despite the limited resources available in her modest room. "You look better this morning, dear," Mrs. Walsh said, speaking slowly and facing Clara directly. Over the past few days, the innkeeper had learned to communicate with her unusual guest through a combination of clear speech, gestures, and patience that Clara found remarkably comforting. Clara nodded and smiled, pulling out the small notebook she now carried everywhere. "I met someone yesterday who was very kind to me," she wrote, showing the page to Mrs. Walsh. "Oh?" Mrs. Walsh's expression brightened with curiosity. "Anyone I might know?" "Thomas Mitchell," Clara wrote. "He has a farm outside town." Mrs. Walsh's face lit up with recognition and approval. "Tom Mitchell! Why, he's one of the finest young men in the county. Lost his parents some years back, but he's made something good of that farm. Keeps to himself mostly, but always polite and honest in his dealings. You could do worse than having him for a friend." The word friend resonated strangely with Clara. In her 23 years, she had few experiences with genuine friendship outside her family. The social dynamics of Cedar Falls had always felt close to her, not through any deliberate cruelty, but through the simple fact that most people didn't know how to bridge the communication gap her deafness created. Thomas, however, had seemed to understand instinctively that conversation could take many forms. Clara spent the morning exploring Millbrook more thoroughly than she had during her first anxious days. The town revealed itself differently when she wasn't consumed with worry about her wedding preparations. The main street bustled with Monday morning commerce, shopkeepers opening their doors and housewives beginning their weekly errands. Clara found herself studying the interactions she observed, noting the easy familiarity between neighbors, the comfortable rhythms of a community that had grown together over years. At Miller's general store, she purchased additional writing supplies and a small sewing kit, practical items that suggested she was settling in rather than preparing for immediate departure. The store's proprietor, a round-faced man named Henry Miller, proved surprisingly adept at communicating with her through gestures and written notes. He recommended the local seamstress, mentioning that many ladies in town might appreciate Clara's needlework skills if she was looking for ways to occupy her time. The suggestion planted a seed in Clara's mind. She had always been skilled with a needle, her mother having taught her advanced techniques that went well beyond basic mending. In Cedar Falls, her work had been limited to her family's needs and occasional gifts for neighbors. But perhaps in Millbrook, her skills could provide both purpose and income while she determined her future. Thomas appeared at the depot precisely at noon, carrying a small picnic basket and wearing what were clearly his best work clothes. Clara felt an unexpected flutter of nervousness as she approached him, suddenly aware that daylight might reveal flaws in their previous evening's connection that darkness had hidden. But Thomas's smile when he saw her was genuine and warm, dispelling her concerns immediately. He had brought writing materials of his own, she noticed, along with what appeared to be a small slate and chalk, tools that might make their communication easier than constantly sharing paper and pencil. "I thought you might enjoy seeing something of the countryside," he wrote on the slate after they had exchanged greetings. "There is a pleasant spot by Miller's Creek where we could talk without the distractions of town." Clara agreed readily, curious to see the landscape that had shaped Thomas's life. They set off together along a well-worn path that led east from town, passing through farmlands that stretched toward wooded hills in the distance. Thomas proved to be an attentive companion, pointing out landmarks and features of the local geography while remaining sensitive to Clara's need to watch his face when he was trying to communicate something important. Miller's Creek meandered through a grove of oak and maple trees, their new leaves creating a canopy of soft green that filtered the spring sunlight into shifting patterns on the ground below. Thomas had chosen their spot carefully, a small clearing beside the water where fallen logs provided natural seating, and the sound of running water created a peaceful backdrop for their written conversation. "This is beautiful," Clara wrote after. They had settled themselves. "Do you come here often?" "Sometimes," Thomas replied on the slate. "When the farm work becomes overwhelming, I find the sound of water helps me think more clearly." Clara looked up at him with surprise, then wrote, "I have never thought about missing sounds, but watching the water move, I think I understand what you mean. There is something peaceful about the rhythm of it." Thomas studied her response for a long moment before writing back, "You see things I never notice, the way the light changes the water's surface, how the trees move even when I cannot feel any wind." Perhaps there are advantages to experiencing the world as you do. It was Clara's turn to look surprised. Most people, when they learned of her deafness, either expressed pity or awkward reassurances that seemed designed more to make them comfortable than to acknowledge her reality. Thomas's suggestion that her condition might offer unique perspectives rather than simply limitations was entirely new in her experience. "I have never thought of it as an advantage," she wrote honestly. "Most people see it as something wrong with me that makes me less suitable for normal life." Thomas's expression darkened slightly as he read her words. "The people who told you that were wrong," he wrote with firm strokes. "Different does not mean less valuable. I have spent my entire life feeling like I do not fit properly into normal life, but that has not made my life worthless." Their conversation continued as they shared the simple lunch Thomas had prepared: bread, cheese, apples, and cold water from the creek. Clara found herself revealing details about her life in Minnesota that she had never shared with anyone, stories about her childhood, experiments with understanding the world through vibration and visual cues, her struggles with loneliness in a hearing world, her dreams of finding someone who could see past her deafness to the person she was beneath. Thomas, in turn, shared his own experiences of isolation, his difficulty connecting with people who seemed to navigate social situations with ease he had never mastered, his fear that he was destined to live his entire life on the periphery of normal human connection. As the afternoon wore on, Clara began to understand that Thomas's silence was not so different from her own, though his was chosen while hers was imposed. "May I ask you something personal?" Clara wrote as the sun began to sink lower in the sky. Thomas nodded, and Clara continued writing. "Yesterday, when I first saw you at the depot, you were watching the train leave with such longing. Where did you want that train to take you?" Thomas stared at her question for several minutes before responding. "Anywhere that was not here," he wrote finally. "I have lived in this place my entire life, but I have never felt like I truly belonged. I thought perhaps somewhere else I might find people who understood me better." "And now?" Clara wrote. Thomas looked directly into her eyes as he wrote his response. "Now, I think perhaps the problem was not the place, but that I was looking for understanding in the wrong way. You have helped me realize that connection does not always require words." Clara felt her cheeks warm at his words, recognizing in them an echo of her own growing feelings. The easy companionship they had discovered seemed to be deepening into something more significant, though neither had yet acknowledged it directly. As they prepared to return to town, Thomas hesitated before writing one more message on the slate. "Clara, I know we have only just met, and I do not want to presume anything about your situation or your feelings, but I would very much like to continue spending time with you, if you are willing." Clara took the chalk from his hand and wrote beneath his words, "I would like that too, Thomas. More than I think I should admit to someone I have known for only 2 days." Thomas's smile at her response was radiant, and Clara realized that somewhere between their first tentative written exchange and this moment beside Miller's Creek, her abandoned wedding had stopped feeling like the end of her story and started feeling like the beginning of something entirely unexpected. The walk back to town took on a different quality. Both of them more aware of each other's presence, their communication becoming more fluid as they developed their own shorthand of gestures and expressions. When they reached the inn, Thomas lingered longer than propriety strictly allowed, both of them reluctant to end their time together. "Tomorrow," Thomas wrote on a piece of paper. "Tomorrow," Clara confirmed in writing, adding, "I would like to see your farm if you would not mind showing it to me." Thomas's eyes widened slightly at her request, and Clara wondered if she had been too forward, but his response reassured her. "I would be honored to show you my home." That evening, Clara sat in her room at the inn, composing a letter to her parents for the first time since leaving Minnesota. She had been dreading this communication, unsure how to explain her circumstances without causing them worry or disappointment. But now, with the memory of her day with Thomas fresh in her mind, she found the words coming more easily. She wrote honestly about Jonathan's abandonment and the dissolution of her wedding plans. But she also wrote about Thomas, about the unexpected friendship that had begun to bloom in the ruins of her original hopes. She described Millbrook and its people, her growing sense that perhaps this unplanned detour in her life might lead to possibilities she had never imagined. As she sealed the letter, Clara reflected on how dramatically her perspective had shifted in just 3 days. The woman who had sat in stunned devastation on that depot bench was still part of her, but she was no longer the whole story. Whatever happened next, Clara no longer felt like a victim of circumstances beyond her control. For the first time in her life, she felt like an active participant in her own destiny. Outside her window, the lights of Millbrook twinkled in the gathering darkness, no longer foreign and intimidating, but beginning to feel like a place where she might belong. "Tomorrow," She would see Thomas's farm, the place that had shaped him into the man who had approached a stranger with kindness and stayed to offer friendship. The thought filled her with an anticipation that was entirely different from the nervous excitement she had felt about her wedding to Jonathan. This feeling was warmer, more grounded, based on genuine connection rather than romantic fantasy. As Clara prepared for bed, she allowed herself to hope that tomorrow would bring further confirmation of what she was beginning to suspect, that sometimes the best destinations are the ones you never planned to reach. Tuesday morning brought the first real spring rain to Millbrook, a gentle shower that turned the dirt roads muddy and filled the air with the scent of awakening earth. Clara woke to the sight of water streaming down her window at the inn, concerned that the weather might interfere with Thomas's promised tour of his farm. She dressed carefully in her most practical clothes, choosing sturdy boots and a dark wool dress that would hide any stains from farm work. When Thomas arrived at the inn, he was driving a covered wagon that would protect them from the worst of the weather. His expression showed concern as he helped Clara climb up to the seat beside him, and he immediately pulled out his slate to write, "We could postpone this if you prefer to wait for better weather." Clara shook her head firmly and wrote back, "I am not made of sugar. I will not dissolve in a little rain." Thomas's laugh was the first she had heard from him, a rich sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it delighted her. The tension in his shoulders eased, and Clara realized he had been nervous about bringing her to his home, perhaps worried that the reality of his bachelor lifestyle might not live up to whatever expectations she had formed. The Mitchell farm lay 3 miles southeast of Millbrook, reached by a winding road that passed through a landscape of rolling hills and established homesteads. Thomas pointed out neighboring properties as they traveled, sharing brief histories of the families who worked the land around his own. The Kowalski farm, with its distinctive red barn, had been established by Polish immigrants 15 years earlier. The Peterson place was known throughout the county for its prize-winning dairy cattle. Old Mr. Henley, now in his 70s, still worked 40 acres with the help of his 3 sons. "All good neighbors," Thomas wrote when they paused to let his horse rest. "They helped me greatly after my parents died, making sure I understood the business side of farming that my father had not yet taught me." Clara sensed there was more to that story, layers of grief and struggle that Thomas was not yet ready to share. She had noticed that he spoke of his parents' death with the careful distance of someone who had learned to carry pain without letting it overwhelm him. It was an approach to sorrow she understood well, having spent years learning to navigate a world that often seemed designed without her needs in mind. The Mitchell farmhouse appeared around a bend in the road, framed by mature oak trees that provided natural windbreaks against the prairie winds. It was a substantial 2-story structure built of local limestone, with a wide front porch and windows that suggested the interior would be filled with natural light. The barn and outbuildings were well maintained, painted in traditional red, with white trim that stood out cheerfully against the grey sky. "Your home is beautiful," Clara wrote as Thomas helped her down from the wagon. "I can see why you love this place." Thomas smiled as he read her words, but Clara noticed a flicker of something else in his expression, a shadow that suggested his relationship with the farmhouse was more complicated than simple love. He led her first to the barn where she met. His livestock, 6 dairy cows, a dozen chickens, 2 workhorses, and a barn cat named Duchess, who regarded Clara with the imperial disdain that seemed to be universal among farm cats. Clara was impressed by the organization and cleanliness of Thomas's operation. Everything had its place, from the precisely arranged tools to the carefully maintained stalls. The attention to detail spoke of someone who found comfort in order and routine, traits she recognized from her own need to create structure in a world that often felt chaotic. "You run this entire operation by yourself," she wrote, after he had shown her the various aspects of his daily routine. "Mostly," Thomas replied on the slate. "I hire extra help during planting and harvest, but the day-to-day work is mine alone. It keeps me busy." Clara heard the unspoken subtext in his words. The farm work was not just Thomas's livelihood, but his refuge from loneliness, a way to fill the hours that might otherwise be spent dwelling on his isolation. She understood that impulse intimately, having spent countless hours in her mother's garden, using physical labor to quiet her own restless thoughts. When the rain began to fall more heavily, Thomas led Clara to the farmhouse, pausing on the front porch to remove their muddy boots. "Please excuse the condition of things," he wrote, suddenly self-conscious. "I do not often have visitors, and I'm afraid my housekeeping reflects that reality." Clara stepped into the main room and immediately understood what Thomas had not said directly. The house felt empty in a way that had nothing to do with cleanliness or organization. The furniture was well made and properly maintained. The floors were clean and the windows sparkled. But there were no personal touches, no signs that this was a home, rather than simply a place where someone slept and ate between farm chores. The kitchen was functional but sparse, containing only the most essential items. The parlor held a few books, a single comfortable chair positioned near the fireplace, and oil lamps that provided adequate light for reading. Everything was practical and neat, but the overall effect was of a man who had never learned to create comfort for himself, who saw his home as shelter rather than sanctuary. "How long have you lived here alone?" Clara wrote, settling into the chair Thomas offered her near the kitchen table. "5 years," Thomas replied. "Since my parents died in the carriage accident, I have been meaning to make changes to add some warmth to the place, but I never seem to know where to begin." Clara looked around the room with new understanding. Thomas had inherited not just a farm, but a fully formed household, complete with his parents' furniture and possessions. Rather than making the space his own, he had simply maintained it as they had left it, like a museum to a life that no longer existed. "May I see the rest of the house?" she wrote. Thomas nodded, though Clara could see his nervousness increasing. He led her through the downstairs rooms, a formal parlor that clearly went unused, a small office where he kept his farm records, and a bedroom that had obviously belonged to his parents and remained exactly as they had left it. Upstairs, Thomas showed her 3 additional bedrooms, 2 of which contained only dust covers and closed curtains. His own room was as Spartan as the rest of the house, containing little beyond a bed, a chest of drawers, and a small desk where he apparently did his personal correspondence. "This house was built for a large family," Clara wrote when they returned to the kitchen. "It must feel very empty with just one person living here." Thomas stared at her words for a long moment before responding. "I always assumed I would fill it with a wife and children someday, but as the years passed, and that seemed less likely, I stopped imagining how it might be different. Now I barely notice the emptiness most of the time." Clara felt a pang of recognition at his words. Her own life had been spent in similar assumptions, waiting for a future that would justify the present, rather than finding ways to make the present fulfilling on its own terms. Jonathan's letters had represented that deferred future, the promise that someday her life would begin in earnest, rather than simply continuing in patient preparation. "Would you mind if I made some tea?" she wrote, gesturing toward the kitchen stove. Thomas nodded gratefully, and Clara set about the familiar ritual of preparing a hot beverage. As she worked, she became more aware of the kitchen's limitations. It was equipped for basic cooking, but lacked the small comforts that made food preparation pleasant. No spice rack, no decorative elements, nothing that suggested cooking was anything more than fuel for continued work. While the tea steeped, Clara explored Thomas's small collection of books, finding volumes on agricultural techniques, weather patterns, and soil management, mixed with a few classics of literature. She was pleased to discover a worn copy of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and several works by Charles Dickens, evidence that Thomas's interests extended beyond the purely practical. "You enjoy reading," she wrote, showing him the Austen novel. "When I have time," Thomas replied, "though I admit I sometimes read the same book multiple times rather than making the effort to acquire new ones. It is easier than traveling to the bookstore in town." Clara smiled at this admission, recognizing in it another sign of Thomas's tendency toward isolation. He had created a comfortable routine that minimized his need to interact with the broader world, even when that routine limited his opportunities for growth or pleasure. As they sat drinking tea, Clara found herself studying the kitchen more carefully, imagining how it might be improved with small additions. Curtains for the windows, herbs growing on the windowsill, perhaps some pottery or other decorative elements that would make the space feel more welcoming. She caught herself in these thoughts and realized she was envisioning herself as part of this household, an assumption that both thrilled and frightened her. "Thomas," she wrote carefully, "may I ask you something that might seem forward?" Thomas nodded, though his expression showed concern at her serious tone. "When you watch those trains leaving Millbrook, are you running towards something or away from something?" Thomas read her question twice before setting down his teacup and reaching for the slate. His response took several minutes to compose. "I think I have been running away from the possibility of disappointment. It seemed safer to dream of life somewhere else than to risk building something here and having it fail." Clara considered his answer thoughtfully before writing back, "I understand that feeling. I spent so many years waiting for my real life to begin that I forgot I was already living it. Jonathan's letters made me believe that happiness was something that would happen to me rather than something I could create for myself. And now," Thomas wrote. Clara looked around the kitchen, at Thomas's earnest face, at the rain streaming down the windows of this house that felt like it was waiting for someone to bring it back to life. "Now, I think perhaps I was looking for the wrong kind of happiness. I was seeking excitement and romance, when what I really needed was understanding and partnership." Thomas's hand stilled on the slate as he read her words. When he looked up, Clara saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. It was hope, tempered by caution but unmistakably present. "Clara," he wrote slowly, "I need to be honest with you about something. Yesterday, when we talked by the creek, I felt more understood than I have in years. Today, seeing you in my home, I cannot help but imagine what it would be like if this emptiness were filled with your presence. I know it is too soon to speak of such things, but I do not want to mislead you about my feelings." Clara's heart began to race as she read his confession. She had been feeling the same pull, the same sense of possibility, but had hesitated to acknowledge it even to herself. The speed with which her feelings were developing seemed almost reckless after the measured pace of her correspondence with Jonathan. "It is too soon," she wrote back, "but that does not make the feelings less real. I find myself imagining changes to your house, improvements that would make it feel more like a home. I think about what it would be like to have a purpose here, to be needed rather than simply tolerated." Thomas reached across the table and gently touched her hand, the first time he had initiated physical contact between them. Clara felt the warmth of his skin, the calluses earned through honest labor, the slight tremor that revealed his nervousness. "What do we do with these feelings?" he wrote with his free hand, his penmanship less steady than usual. Clara considered the question seriously. Her experience with courtship was limited to her correspondence with Jonathan, a relationship that had been built on fantasy rather than genuine knowledge of each other. What she felt for Thomas was different, grounded in actual interaction and mutual understanding, but it was also happening much faster than conventional wisdom suggested was prudent. "We take our time," she wrote finally. "We continue to learn about each other. We see if these feelings deepen with better acquaintance or fade when the novelty wears off. But we are honest about what we are feeling." Thomas nodded, though Clara could see the effort it cost him to accept such a measured approach when his emotions were urging him toward more immediate declarations. She appreciated his restraint, recognizing it as another sign of his fundamental decency. The rain continued through the afternoon, giving them an excuse to remain in the warm kitchen, talking through their written exchanges about everything from farming techniques to favorite books to childhood memories. Clara shared stories about her life in Minnesota, her struggles with fitting into a hearing world, her dreams of finding meaningful work that would utilize her skills. Thomas told her about his parents, their loving partnership that had made the farmhouse feel alive, his struggles to maintain their legacy while creating his own identity as a farmer and a man. He spoke honestly about his failed attempts at courtship, his growing conviction that he was destined for solitude, his surprise at finding someone who seemed to understand his particular form of loneliness. As evening approached and the rain finally began to ease, both of them became aware that Clara would need to return to town soon. The prospect of parting felt more difficult than it had the previous day, weighted as it now was with spoken feelings and acknowledged possibilities. "May I call on you again tomorrow?" Thomas wrote as he prepared the wagon for their return journey. "I would be disappointed if you did not," Clara replied, adding, "Perhaps we could visit some of the places in town that I have not yet seen. I'm curious about the church you attend and the people who make up your community." Thomas's expression showed both pleasure and anxiety at her suggestion. Clara realized she was asking him to introduce her to his neighbors, to acknowledge their growing friendship publicly in a small town where such things would be noticed and discussed. It was a significant step, one that would move their relationship from private discovery to community awareness. "Are you certain you want to meet my neighbors?" Thomas wrote. "Small towns can be very curious about newcomers, especially when they are seen in the company of confirmed bachelors." Clara smiled at his concern. "I have spent my entire life being the subject of curious speculation," she wrote back. "At least in Millbrook, the curiosity will be about my presence rather than my absence." As they drove back to town through the clearing evening air, Clara reflected on how much had changed in the space of a single day. This morning, she had been a woman without clear direction, suspended between her abandoned past and an uncertain future. Now she felt the stirrings of purpose, the possibility that her unexpected detour in Millbrook might become a destination rather than simply a delay. The farmhouse they left behind no longer seemed empty to her. Instead, it felt full of potential, a place where two lonely people might build something together that neither could create alone. Whether that potential would be realized remained to be seen, but for the first time since receiving Rebecca's letter, Clara felt genuinely hopeful about what tomorrow might bring. Wednesday dawned crisp and clear, the kind of spring morning that made every color seem more vivid and every shadow sharper. Clara had slept deeply for the first time since arriving in Millbrook, her dreams filled with images of limestone farmhouses and empty rooms waiting to be transformed. She woke with a sense of anticipation that felt entirely different from the nervous excitement she had experienced before her planned wedding to Jonathan. Mrs. Walsh noticed the change immediately when Clara came down for breakfast. "You have the look of a woman who has found her footing," she observed, setting a plate of eggs and fresh bread before her guest. "Yesterday's outing seems to have agreed with you." Clara nodded and wrote in her notebook, "Mr. Mitchell showed me his farm. It is a beautiful property, though it feels like it is waiting for someone to bring it fully to life. Mrs. Walsh's eyebrows rose with interest. Tom Mitchell's place was something to see when his parents were alive. Helen Mitchell had the finest garden in 3 counties, and their house was always full of music and laughter. Tom's a good man, but he's never learned how to make that house feel like home again. The comment reinforced Clara's impressions from the previous day. She found herself wondering what Helen Mitchell had been like, what touches she had added to make the farmhouse feel warm and welcoming. More importantly, she wondered if she herself possessed the skills and intuition necessary to help Thomas reclaim that sense of home. Thomas arrived at the inn precisely at 10 o'clock, dressed in his Sunday clothes, despite the fact that it was midweek. Clara appreciated the effort he had made for their planned tour of Millbrook, though she could see the tension in his shoulders that suggested he was nervous about introducing her to his community. "Are you ready to meet the good people of Millbrook?" he wrote on his slate after they had exchanged morning greetings. "As ready as I can be," Clara replied, "though I should warn you that I am not always skilled at making good first impressions. People often do not know what to make of me." "Then they are fools," Thomas wrote with unusual firmness. "Anyone who cannot see your worth within 5 minutes of meeting you is not worth impressing." Clara felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. Jonathan had often written about her intelligence and refinement, but his compliments had felt abstract, based more on her letters than on genuine knowledge of her character. Thomas's defense of her felt grounded in actual observation and understanding. Their first stop was Miller's General Store, where Clara had already made a favorable impression during her earlier shopping expedition. Henry Miller greeted them both warmly, his eyes showing keen interest in their obvious friendship, but his manner remaining respectful and welcoming. "Miss Henderson, how are you settling into our little town?" Miller asked, speaking clearly and facing Clara directly. Clara wrote her response in the notebook she now carried everywhere. "Very well, thank you. Mr. Mitchell has been kind enough to show me the countryside. It is a beautiful country." Miller read her note and nodded approvingly. "Tom's family has been working that land for 3 generations. Best soil in the county, and Tom's maintained it better than his father did, if I'm being honest." Thomas's face reddened slightly at the praise, but Clara could see that he was pleased by Miller's endorsement. She was beginning to understand that Thomas's reputation in the community was solid but quiet, built on consistent reliability rather than flashy achievement. Their next visit was to the church where Thomas worshipped, a modest white building with clear windows and simple wooden pews. Reverend William Harwood was tending to some administrative tasks in his small office when they arrived, and he welcomed the unexpected visitors with genuine warmth. Reverend Harwood proved to be an unusually perceptive man, who quickly grasped Clara's communication needs without making her feel like an object of pity or curiosity. He had encountered deaf congregants before, he explained through careful speech and written notes, and he made sure to face Clara directly when speaking so she could read his lips. "Miss Henderson, Thomas tells me you are visiting from Minnesota," the Reverend said. "What brings you to our community?" Clara hesitated only briefly before writing an honest response. "I came here for a wedding that did not take place. I have decided to stay for a while, to see what else life might offer me here." The Reverend read her note with compassion, but without the excessive sympathy that Clara had learned to dread. "Sometimes the paths we plan are not the ones we are meant to walk," he said simply. "I have found that God often has better ideas than we do about where we belong." Thomas relaxed visibly at the Reverend's acceptance of Clara's situation. Clara realized that he had been worried about how his community would react to her unconventional circumstances, and the Reverend's matter-of-fact response seemed to ease those concerns. "Thomas, I hope you will bring Miss Henderson to Sunday service this week," Reverend Harwood continued. "I think she would find our congregation welcoming." As they left the church, Clara wrote to Thomas, He seems like a good man. Does he always make newcomers feel so comfortable? Reverend Harwood has a gift for seeing people clearly, Thomas replied. He helped me greatly after my parents died, not by offering empty consolations, but by helping me understand that grief could coexist with hope. Their tour continued to the schoolhouse, where they met Miss Catherine Sullivan, the young teacher who had arrived in Millbrook 2 years earlier. Fresh from her training in Philadelphia, Miss Sullivan was immediately fascinated by Clara's situation and peppered her with questions about her education and her methods for learning without hearing. "I have read about schools for the deaf," Miss Sullivan wrote in Clara's notebook, having quickly adopted their written communication system. The work being done to develop sign language as a formal method of education is fascinating. Do you know any of these signs? Clara shook her head, writing back, "My education was entirely through reading and writing. My mother was a teacher before marriage, and she made sure I could read well. But I have heard of these sign languages you mention." Miss Sullivan's eyes lit up with excitement. "There is a school in Philadelphia that is doing remarkable work with deaf students. They have developed a complete system of hand signs that allows for rapid communication. I would love to learn more about it myself." Thomas watched this exchange with growing interest. Clara could see that he was intrigued by the possibility of learning more efficient ways to communicate with her, though he seemed somewhat overwhelmed by Miss Sullivan's enthusiasm for educational theory. Their final stop was at the seamstress shop that Miller had recommended, run by a widow named Mrs. Eleanor Ross. Mrs. Ross proved to be a shrewd businesswoman who quickly recognized the quality of Clara's needlework when she examined the embroidery on Clara's dress. "This is exquisite work," Mrs. Ross said, running her fingers over the delicate stitching at Clara's collar. "Who taught you to embroider like this?" "My mother," Clara wrote. "She learned from her mother, who brought the techniques from Ireland." Mrs. Ross nodded approvingly. "I have more work than I can handle, especially with the spring wedding season approaching. Would you be interested in taking on some projects? I pay fair wages for quality work." Clara felt a surge of excitement at the offer. The prospect of meaningful work that could support her while she determined her future in Millbrook was exactly what she needed. "I would be very interested," she wrote. "Excellent," Mrs. Ross replied. "Can you start Monday? I have 3 wedding dresses that need detailed beadwork and several ladies who want fancy embroidery on their spring dresses." As they walked back toward the inn, Clara reflected on how differently this day had gone compared to her original expectations. Instead of being the object of curious stares or awkward sympathy, she had been welcomed as a potential contributing member of the community. The offer of work from Mrs. Ross was particularly significant, providing her with both income and purpose while she decided what direction her life should take. "Your neighbors are kinder than I expected," she wrote to Thomas as they paused on the inn's front porch. "They are good people," Thomas agreed. "Perhaps not sophisticated in the ways that city folk might prefer, but honest and decent. I think they see in you someone who shares those values." Clara looked up at Thomas's face, noting the way his expression had relaxed throughout the day as he watched her interact successfully with his community. She realized that her acceptance by his neighbors was important to him, not just for her sake, but because it validated his own judgment in befriending her. "Thomas," she wrote carefully, "may I ask you something about your parents?" Thomas nodded, though she could see tension return to his shoulders at the mention of his family. "Mrs. Walsh mentioned that your mother made your house feel warm and welcoming. What kinds of things did she do that you miss most?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring at the slate before beginning to write. "She had plants everywhere," he wrote finally. "Flowers in the windows, herbs in the kitchen, a vegetable garden that was as beautiful as it was productive. She made quilts and curtains that added color to every room. But most of all, She made our house feel like the center of something important, a place where people wanted to gather. Clara read his words and felt her heart ache for the loss he had sustained, but she also felt a stirring of possibility, a sense that perhaps she could help him reclaim some of what had been lost. "Would you be offended if I made some suggestions for changes to your house?" she wrote. "Small things that might make it feel more welcoming." Thomas's eyes widened with surprise, and Clara worried that she had overstepped some boundary, but his response reassured her. "I would welcome any suggestions you might have. I have wanted to make changes, but never knew where to begin." "Nothing dramatic," Clara wrote quickly. "Perhaps some curtains for the kitchen windows, herbs growing on the windowsill, a few personal touches that would make the space feel more like yours rather than a museum to your parents' memory." Thomas studied her words for several minutes before responding. "Would you help me?" he wrote. "I do not trust my own judgment about such things, but I trust yours." Clara felt her pulse quicken at his request. The implications of helping Thomas redecorate his home were significant, suggesting a level of intimacy and involvement in his life that went well beyond casual friendship. Yet the prospect excited rather than frightened her. "I would be honored to help," she wrote back. "We could start with small changes and see how they feel." Thomas's smile was radiant, and Clara realized that she had just committed herself to spending considerable time at his farm, working together to transform his house into a home. The prospect filled her with nervous energy and a sense of purpose she had never experienced before. As Thomas prepared to leave, he wrote one final message. "Clara, I want you to know that today has been one of the happiest I can remember. Watching you meet my neighbors, seeing how naturally you fit into this community, it makes me hope for things I had given up on." Clara read his words and felt tears prick at her eyes. "What kinds of things?" she wrote back. Thomas hesitated, then wrote with careful deliberation, "The possibility that my house might someday feel like a home again, the chance that I might not spend the rest of my life alone, the hope that someone might choose to build a life here with me." Clara's breath caught as she read his confession. She understood that Thomas was not making a proposal, but he was acknowledging the direction his thoughts were taking, the future he was beginning to imagine with her as part of it. "Those are worthy hopes," she wrote carefully. "I find myself harboring similar ones, though it seems remarkable that they should develop so quickly. Perhaps," Thomas wrote, "when two people have been lonely for a long time, they recognize in each other something worth holding on to." That evening, alone, in her room at the inn, Clara wrote another letter to her parents. This time, she wrote with growing confidence about her decision to remain in Millbrook temporarily, about the work opportunity with Mrs. Ross, and about Thomas's friendship and the possibility of something deeper developing between them. She described the farmhouse and its potential, the community that had welcomed her, and the sense of purpose she was beginning to feel. Most importantly, she wrote about the growing conviction that her failed wedding to Jonathan had not been a catastrophe, but a redirection towards something better suited to her true nature and needs. As she sealed the letter, Clara reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in less than a week. The woman who had sat in devastation on the depot bench seemed like a different person now, someone defined by disappointment rather than possibility. The woman she was becoming felt stronger, more capable of shaping her own destiny rather than simply accepting whatever fate offered her. Outside her window, the lights of Millbrook glowed warmly in the spring darkness. Tomorrow she would begin work with Mrs. Ross, establishing herself as a contributing member of this community. This weekend, she would help Thomas begin transforming his house, creating the beginning of what might become their shared home. For the first time in her life, Clara felt like she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The silence that had once isolated her from the world now felt like a gift, creating space for the kind of deep understanding she had found with Thomas. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she faced them with a confidence born of genuine connection and mutual respect. The future was no longer something that would happen to her, but something she was actively creating with each choice, each gesture, each moment of courage that brought her closer to the life she was meant to live. The following Monday arrived with unseasonable warmth that seemed to promise summer's early arrival. Clara woke at dawn, excited to begin her first day of work with Mrs. Ross, and eager to establish herself as more than just a temporary visitor to Millbrook. She dressed carefully in her most practical work dress, one that would allow her to move freely while maintaining the professional appearance Mrs. Ross would expect from her employees. At precisely 8 o'clock, Clara presented herself at the seamstress shop, a narrow building squeezed between the barber shop and the bank on Millbrook's main street. Mrs. Ross was already at work, bent over an intricate beading pattern that caught the morning light streaming through the large front windows. Punctual, Mrs. Ross observed approvingly as Clara entered. "I value that in my workers. Time is money in this business, and customers expect their orders to be completed when promised." Clara nodded and pulled out her notebook. "What would you like me to begin with?" she wrote. Mrs. Ross led her to a work table near the back of the shop, where 3 wedding dresses hung in various stages of completion. The first was a simple ivory silk that needed elaborate beadwork along the bodice and sleeves. The second required delicate embroidery around the neckline and hem. The third was the most challenging, a pale blue dress with an intricate pattern of flowers and vines that would need to be embroidered across the entire skirt. "The ivory dress belongs to Martha Peterson," Mrs. Ross explained, speaking clearly so Clara could read her lips. "She is marrying Henry Kowalski's eldest son next month. The beadwork pattern is drawn on the fabric, but it requires someone with steady hands and an eye for detail." Clara examined the dress carefully, running her fingers over the delicate silk and studying the complexity of the beading pattern. It was ambitious work that would require many hours of precise stitching, but she felt confident in her ability to execute it properly. "The blue dress is for Elizabeth Harwood, the Reverend's niece," Mrs. Ross continued. "She has very specific ideas about how she wants the flowers to look, and she has rejected 2 previous attempts by other seamstresses. I am hoping your touch will be more to her liking." Clara studied the blue dress with growing interest. The embroidery pattern was indeed complex, but she could see ways to enhance the design that would make the flowers appear more realistic and 3-dimensional. She had learned advanced shading techniques from her mother that were not commonly known among seamstresses. "I would like to try some sample stitches first," Clara wrote, "to make sure my technique meets your standards before I begin on the actual dresses." Mrs. Ross nodded approvingly. "Wise approach. I have some practice fabric you can use to show me your work." Clara spent the first 2 hours of her workday creating sample pieces that demonstrated her range of skills. She worked steadily, her hands moving with the automatic precision that came from years of practice. Mrs. Ross checked on her progress periodically, her expressions growing increasingly pleased as she examined Clara's work. "Exceptional," Mrs. Ross finally declared, studying a sample of French knots that Clara had created to demonstrate her technique for flower centers. "I have not seen work of this quality since my grandmother was alive. Where did you learn to do shading like this?" Clara wrote her explanation about her mother's Irish heritage and the traditional techniques that had been passed down through generations. Mrs. Ross read the note with growing excitement. "This changes everything," Mrs. Ross said. "If you can Produce work of this caliber consistently, I can charge premium prices and attract customers from as far away as Philadelphia. Would you be interested in a permanent position rather than just temporary work? Clara felt her heart leap at the offer. Permanent employment would mean financial independence and the ability to support herself while she determined her future. With Thomas, she wrote her acceptance immediately. "Excellent," Mrs. Ross replied. "I will pay you $15 per week to start, with increases based on the volume and quality of your output. You will have Sundays off and can leave early on Saturdays if your work is current." The terms were more generous than Clara had dared to hope. $15 per week would allow her to pay for her room at the inn indefinitely while still saving money for future needs. More importantly, the work itself promised to be satisfying and challenging in ways that her needlework at home had never been. Clara spent the remainder of her first day beginning the beadwork on Martha Peterson's wedding dress. The pattern was intricate but not impossibly complex, and she found herself falling into a meditative rhythm as she attached each tiny bead with precise, even stitches. The work required complete concentration, leaving no room for worrying about the future or dwelling on past disappointments. When Mrs. Ross locked the shop at 6 o'clock, Clara felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with the wages she would earn. For the first time in her life, she was contributing something valuable to the world beyond her family's household, using her skills to create beauty that would mark important moments in other people's lives. Thomas was waiting for her outside the shop, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers he had obviously picked from the meadows around his farm. His face lit up when he saw her emerge from the building, and Clara felt a warm glow of happiness at his thoughtfulness. "How was your first day?" he wrote on his slate after presenting her with the flowers. "Better than I could have hoped," Clara replied in her notebook. "Mrs. Ross has offered me permanent employment, and the work is exactly the kind I most enjoy doing." Thomas's smile was radiant as he read her words. Clara realized that her success mattered to him not just because he cared about her happiness, but because it meant she would be staying in Millbrook permanently, rather than eventually returning to Minnesota. "I have something to show you," Thomas wrote. "Would you mind coming to the farm this evening? I have made some preparations for the changes we discussed." Clara nodded eagerly, curious about what Thomas might have done. They walked together to where he had left his wagon, and Clara noticed that he had taken special care with his appearance today, wearing a clean shirt and vest that suggested he viewed this evening as significant. The drive to the farm gave them time to share details about their respective days. Thomas had spent his morning in the fields preparing for spring planting, but he had devoted his afternoon to projects related to Clara's suggestions for improving his house. He had been mysterious about the specifics, writing only that he hoped she would approve of his efforts. When they reached the farmhouse, Clara immediately noticed changes. The front porch had been swept clean and arranged with 2 chairs, positioned to take advantage of the evening light. A small table between them held a pitcher of water and glasses, suggesting that Thomas had planned for them to spend time outside. "Together, the changes are inside," Thomas wrote, gesturing toward the front door with obvious nervousness. Clara followed him into the house and gasped at what she saw. The main room had been thoroughly cleaned and rearranged, with furniture positioned to create conversation areas rather than simply filling space. More dramatically, Thomas had hung new curtains in the windows, simple white cotton that softened the harsh lines of the room and made the space feel immediately more welcoming. "Thomas, these are beautiful," Clara wrote, moving to examine the curtains more closely. "Where did you find them?" "I made them," Thomas replied, his face reddening with embarrassment. "My mother taught me basic sewing when I was young, in case I ever needed to mend my own clothes. I remembered enough to manage something simple." Clara stared at him in amazement. The idea of this practical farmer spending his afternoon bent over a sewing machine, carefully hemming curtains to surprise her, touched her more deeply than any romantic gesture Jonathan had ever described in his letters. "They are perfect," she wrote. "The room already feels more like a home." Thomas led her to the kitchen, where more changes awaited. He had cleared the windowsill and arranged it with small pots containing herb seedlings: basil, thyme, rosemary, and parsley. A new tablecloth covered the kitchen table, and he had added a simple centerpiece made from branches and early spring flowers. "I thought you might help me plan a proper garden," Thomas wrote. "My mother's garden plot has been fallow for 5 years. I would like to restore it, but I need someone with knowledge of what grows well together." Clara walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the area Thomas indicated. She could see the remains of what had once been an elaborate garden: overgrown beds, broken trellises, and fruit trees that needed pruning. But she could also see the excellent soil and ideal location that had made Helen Mitchell's garden legendary in the county. "It will be a lot of work," Clara wrote, "but the bones of a good garden are still there. With proper planning and care, it could be beautiful again." Thomas joined her at the window, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Would you help me plan it?" he wrote. "I know it is asking a great deal, but I would value your input on what to plant and where." Clara turned to look at his face, seeing in his expression something deeper than a simple request for gardening advice. Thomas was asking her to help him restore a part of his family's legacy, to participate in creating something that would outlast their individual involvement. It was an invitation to become part of the farm's future in a fundamental way. "I would love to help you," she wrote, "but I should warn you that I have strong opinions about garden design. My mother and I used to argue about the proper placement of vegetables versus flowers." Thomas laughed, and Clara realized she was learning to love that sound. "I welcome strong opinions," he wrote. "This house has been without them for too long." They spent the evening on the front porch, sharing the simple dinner Thomas had prepared and making preliminary plans for the garden restoration. Thomas had saved seed catalogues from previous years, and they spread these across the small table, debating the merits of different varieties and planning the layout of beds. Clara found herself sketching garden designs in her notebook, her ideas flowing freely as she imagined the possibilities. She drew elaborate flower borders, vegetable plots arranged for both beauty and efficiency, and herb gardens positioned near the kitchen for convenience. Thomas watched her work with fascination, occasionally asking questions that revealed his practical knowledge of soil conditions and growing seasons. "You have a real talent for this," Thomas wrote, as Clara showed him a detailed drawing of a proposed flower bed. "Have you ever considered that you might have a future in garden design?" Clara looked up from her sketching in surprise. The idea had never occurred to her, but she realized that Thomas was right. She had always assumed her skills with plants were simply domestic accomplishments, but perhaps they could be something more. Mrs. Ross mentioned that wealthy families in the area sometimes hire designers for their landscaping. Thomas continued, "Your eye for beauty and your understanding of plants might be valuable to people who have money but lack knowledge." The suggestion opened possibilities Clara had never considered. Combined with her needlework income, garden design could provide her with complete financial independence and the ability to pursue work that felt meaningful rather than merely necessary. As darkness fell and oil lamps were lit on the porch, their conversation turned more personal. Thomas shared memories of his parents' marriage, the way they had worked together to build their life on the farm, the sense of partnership that had made their relationship seem effortless from the outside. "I used to think I would naturally find that kind of connection," Thomas wrote. "When it did not happen with other women I tried to court, I began to believe that perhaps I was not capable of inspiring such feelings." Clara read his words and felt her heart ache for the self-doubt he had carried. "Perhaps," she wrote back, "you were simply looking for connection with the wrong people. Some forms of understanding cannot be forced or manufactured." "Do you think we have found that understanding?" Thomas wrote, his hand trembling slightly as he formed the words. Clara looked at his face in the lamplight, seeing vulnerability and hope warring in his expression. The question hung between them, demanding honesty that could change everything about their relationship. "I think we have found the beginning of it," she wrote carefully. "Whether it deepens into something lasting remains to be seen, but what we have already discovered feels precious to me." Thomas reached across the table and covered her hand with his own, a gesture that had become familiar but still sent warmth shooting through Clara's body. "Clara," he wrote with his free hand, "I need you to know that my feelings for you are not based on gratitude or loneliness. You have awakened something in me that I thought was dead. The possibility of building a life with you feels like the answer to prayers I was afraid to voice." Clara stared at his words for a long moment, feeling the weight of his confession and the responsibility it placed on her. She understood that Thomas was offering her his heart completely, trusting her with feelings he had protected carefully. "For years, my feelings for you are equally strong," she wrote in response, "but I want to be certain that what we feel is based on genuine compatibility rather than circumstance. We are both lonely people who found each other at vulnerable moments. I want to be sure that what grows between us can survive happiness as well as hardship." Thomas nodded, though Clara could see the effort it cost him to accept her caution. "What do you suggest we do?" he wrote. Clara considered the question seriously. "We continue as we have been," she wrote finally. "We work together on projects that matter to both of us. We learn each other's habits and preferences and flaws. We see how we handle disagreements and disappointments, and we remain honest about what we discover. And if what we discover is that we are well suited to build a life together," Thomas wrote. Clara felt her pulse quicken at the directness of his question. "Then we will build that life," she wrote back, "together." Thomas lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a gentle kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so tender that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. In that moment, she understood that whatever happened between them, she had already been changed by knowing him. The woman who had been abandoned at the train depot was gone forever, replaced by someone stronger and more confident in her ability to create the life she wanted. As Thomas drove her back to town that evening, Clara reflected on how much had changed in the space of a single week. She had meaningful work that utilized her skills, a community that had welcomed her, and the beginning of a relationship that promised the kind of deep partnership she had only read about in novels. Most importantly, she had discovered that her deafness, which she had always seen as a limitation, might actually be an advantage in finding the right person to share her life with. Thomas valued her silence, understood her different way of experiencing the world, and communicated with her in ways that felt more intimate than any conversation she had ever had. The future stretched before her, full of possibilities she had never imagined when she first arrived in Millbrook as an abandoned bride. Now she was becoming something entirely different, a woman who had chosen her own path and found love not through desperate searching, but through patient cultivation of genuine understanding. 3 weeks into May, Clara had established a routine that brought structure and satisfaction to her days in Millbrook. She rose each morning at 6, took breakfast with Mrs. Walsh at the inn, and arrived at the seamstress shop by 7:30 to begin her needlework. The precision required for her embroidery and beadwork demanded complete focus, creating a meditative state that she found deeply calming. By noon, when she broke for lunch, Clara often felt as though she had accomplished something meaningful with her morning hours. Mrs. Ross had proven to be an excellent employer, appreciating Clara's skill while respecting her communication needs. The older woman had even begun learning basic written exchanges to make their interactions more efficient. More importantly, word of Clara's exceptional needlework had begun to spread throughout the county, bringing customers from neighboring towns who specifically requested her services. The afternoon of May 22nd brought an unexpected challenge that would test both Clara's professional skills and her growing confidence in her place within the Millbrook community. Mrs. Ross had gone to Philadelphia on business, leaving Clara alone in the shop when the door chime announced a visitor. Clara looked up from her work to see a well-dressed woman in her 40s examining the displays with the critical eye of someone accustomed to luxury. The woman's clothing was expensive and fashionable, her posture suggesting someone who expected immediate attention and deference from shopkeepers. Clara rose from her work table and approached the customer with a welcoming smile, pulling out her notebook to facilitate communication. The woman's expression changed immediately when Clara began to write rather than speak, her eyebrows rising with surprise and what appeared to be displeasure. "Are you the seamstress?" the woman asked, speaking loudly and slowly, as if Clara were mentally deficient rather than simply deaf. Clara wrote her response carefully. "I am one of the seamstresses here. Mrs. Ross is away today, but I can help you with your needs." The woman read the note with obvious irritation. "I am Mrs. Jonathan Whitmore," she announced, as if the name should carry special significance. "I have come from Philadelphia specifically to commission a dress for my son's wedding. I was told this shop produces work of exceptional quality." Clara felt the blood drain from her face as she processed the woman's identity. This was Jonathan's mother, the woman whose objections had destroyed Clara's own wedding plans just a month earlier. The irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. The woman who had deemed Clara unsuitable for her son was now seeking Clara's services without knowing who she was. Mrs. Whitmore continued speaking, unaware of Clara's shock. "The wedding is in 6 weeks, and I need a dress that will demonstrate our family's position in Philadelphia society. I'm willing to pay premium prices for exceptional work, but I expect perfection." Clara struggled to compose herself, fighting the urge to reveal her identity and confront this woman about the pain she had caused. But professional instincts and simple dignity prevailed. She wrote a careful response. "What style of dress did you have in mind? Mrs. Ross has pattern books from New York and Paris that might interest you." Mrs. Whitmore spent the next hour describing her requirements in exhaustive detail. She wanted a dress of deep burgundy silk with elaborate beadwork and embroidery that would showcase her figure while maintaining appropriate formality for a mother of the groom. The work she described would require weeks of intensive labor and the most advanced techniques Clara possessed. "Can you execute work of this complexity?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, studying Clara with skeptical eyes. "I have heard that this shop employs someone with exceptional skills, but I had expected someone more experienced." Clara drew herself up to her full height and wrote with firm strokes, "I can produce work that will meet your highest expectations. My embroidery has been praised by customers throughout the county." Mrs. Whitmore remained doubtful until Clara showed her samples of her work, including the intricate beadwork she had completed for other customers. The woman's expression gradually shifted from skepticism to genuine interest as she examined the quality of Clara's stitching. "This is indeed exceptional," Mrs. Whitmore admitted grudgingly. "Very well, I will commission the dress from you, but I want to be clear about my expectations. Any flaw, any imperfection, and I will not pay for the work." Clara nodded and wrote the commission details in her order book, including Mrs. Whitmore's measurements and specific requirements. The woman paid a substantial deposit and arranged to return in 2 weeks for a fitting, emphasizing again her expectation of perfection. After Mrs. Whitmore left the shop, Clara sat alone with her thoughts, struggling to process the encounter. The woman who had destroyed her plans to marry Jonathan had just entrusted her with creating a dress for that very wedding. The situation felt like a test of some kind, though Clara was not certain what lesson she was supposed to learn from it. When Thomas arrived that evening to escort her to the farm for their weekly garden planning session, Clara debated whether to tell him about her encounter with Mrs. Whitmore. She had shared the story of her abandoned wedding with Thomas, but bringing up Jonathan's family felt like inviting the past to intrude on their growing relationship. Thomas noticed her subdued mood immediately. "You seem troubled," he wrote as they drove toward his farm. "Did something happen at work today?" Clara made a quick decision to be honest. She wrote a brief account of Mrs. Whitmore's visit, watching Thomas's face as he read her description of the ironic situation. Thomas's expression darkened as he absorbed the implications. "The mother of the man who abandoned you has asked you to create a dress for his wedding to someone else," he wrote. "That seems like a particularly cruel twist of fate. I think it might be an opportunity instead," Clara wrote back, surprising herself with the realization. "Mrs. Whitmore judged me unsuitable for her son without ever meeting me. Now she will see the quality of my work and perhaps understand that she misjudged my worth." Thomas studied her response for several minutes before writing back, "You planned to show her that her loss was someone else's gain." Clara nodded, feeling her confidence returning. "Exactly. And more than that, I planned to create the most beautiful dress I have ever made, not for her sake, but for my own pride in my work." Thomas's smile was warm with admiration. "I think that is exactly the right approach," he wrote. "You will show her what true quality looks like, and she will never know that she had the chance to have you as a daughter-in-law." The conversation shifted Clara's perspective on the commission entirely. What had initially felt like a painful reminder of her rejection now seemed like an opportunity to demonstrate her professional skill and personal growth. She would pour her best efforts into Mrs. Whitmore's dress, creating something so beautiful that the woman would never forget the seamstress who had made it. At the farm, Thomas had prepared another surprise for Clara. He had spent the week clearing and preparing 2 large garden beds, according to the plans they had developed together. The soil had been turned and enriched with compost, and he had constructed raised borders that would make the beds easier to maintain. "Thomas, this is wonderful," Clara wrote as she examined his work. "You have been busy." "I wanted to have everything ready for planting," Thomas replied. "The seed packets arrived from the catalog company, and I thought we could begin this weekend if the weather holds." Clara walked the perimeter of the prepared beds, envisioning how they would look when filled with the flowers and vegetables they had planned. The larger bed would hold vegetables arranged in neat rows: tomatoes, beans, squash, and corn. The smaller bed was designated for flowers: zinnias, marigolds, hollyhocks, and the climbing roses that would eventually cover the trellis Thomas had repaired. "There is something else I want to show you," Thomas wrote, leading her toward the house. Inside, Clara discovered that Thomas had been busy with interior improvements as well. He had painted the kitchen walls a warm yellow color that made the room feel brighter and more cheerful. New shelving held dishes and supplies in organized displays, and he had added a comfortable chair by the window where someone could sit and read while keeping an eye on cooking meals. "It feels like a different room," Clara wrote, amazed by the transformation. "Much more welcoming." "I had help planning the changes," Thomas admitted, his face reddening slightly. "I asked Mrs. Walsh for advice about colors and arrangements. She said yellow would make the room feel sunny, even on cloudy days." Clara was touched by Thomas's effort to seek guidance in areas where he felt uncertain. His willingness to admit his limitations and ask for help spoke to a humility and practical wisdom that she found deeply attractive. They spent the evening planting seeds in the prepared garden beds, working side by side as the late spring sun cast long shadows across the farmyard. Clara found herself thinking about the contrast between this peaceful domestic scene and the drama of her encounter with Mrs. Whitmore. Here, kneeling in the dirt beside Thomas as they carefully placed bean seeds at proper intervals, she felt a contentment that had nothing to do with social position or public recognition. "Clara," Thomas wrote during a break in their planting, "may I ask you something about your former fiancé?" Clara nodded, though she felt a flicker of unease at the direction of his thoughts. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if his family had not interfered?" Thomas continued. "If you had married him as planned?" Clara considered the question seriously before responding. "I used to wonder about that," she wrote. "But meeting his mother today made me realize something important. Jonathan chose his family's approval over his feelings for me. That tells me everything I need to know about his character." Thomas read her response and nodded slowly. "A man who truly loved you would have defended you," he wrote. "He would have seen his family's objections as wrong rather than as insurmountable obstacles." "Exactly," Clara replied, "which means that Jonathan never really loved me at all. He loved the idea of me, or perhaps he loved my letters, but he did not love me enough to fight for our relationship when it was challenged." Thomas set down his trowel and looked directly into Clara's eyes. "I want you to know," he wrote carefully, "that if anyone ever tried to convince me that you were unsuitable for any reason, I would defend you without hesitation. Your deafness does not diminish your worth, and anyone who suggests otherwise would have to answer to me." Clara felt tears spring to her eyes at his declaration. The fierce protectiveness in Thomas's expression left no doubt about the sincerity of his words. This was what Jonathan's devotion should have looked like, she realized, this willingness to stand firm against opposition, to value her above the approval of others. "Thank you," she wrote simply, knowing that those words carried insufficient weight for the emotion behind them. As they finished planting and cleaned their tools in the gathering darkness, Clara reflected on the day's events. Mrs. Whitmore's unexpected appearance had initially felt like an intrusion from her painful past, but it had ultimately served to highlight how much her life had improved since arriving in Millbrook. She had meaningful work that utilized her skills and provided financial independence. She had found a community that valued her contributions rather than focusing on her limitations. Most importantly, she had discovered a relationship with Thomas that was built on genuine understanding and mutual respect rather than romantic fantasy. "Thomas," she wrote as they prepared to return to town, "I want you to know that whatever happens with Mrs. Whitmore's dress, today has been one of the happiest I can remember. Working in the garden with you, seeing the improvements you have made to your home, feeling like we are building something together. It means more to me than I can express in writing." Thomas's response was immediate and heartfelt. "Clara, you have given me back something I thought I had lost forever. Hope, purpose, the sense that my life has meaning beyond simply maintaining what my parents built. I cannot imagine returning to the emptiness I felt before I met you." As they drove back to Millbrook under a canopy of stars, Clara felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected path her life had taken. The woman who had been abandoned at the train depot had been transformed into someone stronger, more confident, and more capable of recognizing genuine love when she found it. Mrs. Whitmore's commission would be completed with perfect skill and professional pride, but it would also serve as a symbol of Clara's transformation. Every stitch would be a declaration that she had found something far better than what she had lost, that true worth could not be measured by social approval or family connections. The abandoned bride had become a woman who chose her own destiny, and that destiny was bright with possibility. The first week of June brought an intensity to Clara's work that she had never experienced before. Mrs. Whitmore's dress demanded techniques that pushed her skills to their absolute limits, requiring her to develop new methods for achieving the complex effects the design demanded. Clara found herself staying late at the seamstress shop, working by lamplight to perfect each intricate detail of the burgundy silk gown. The bodice alone required over 200 hours of beadwork, with each crystal bead positioned to catch light at precisely the right angle. The skirt featured an elaborate embroidered pattern of grapevines and roses that seemed to grow organically from the fabric itself. Clara had never attempted anything so ambitious, but she discovered that the challenge awakened abilities she had not known she possessed. Mrs. Ross returned from Philadelphia to find her shop transformed by Clara's industrious efforts. Work tables were covered with sketches, thread samples, and partially completed sections of the most elaborate dress either woman had ever seen in progress. "My dear girl," Mrs. Ross said, examining Clara's work with obvious awe, "this is museum quality craftsmanship. I have never seen embroidery this sophisticated outside of royal collections." Clara paused in her stitching to write a response. "Mrs. Whitmore demands perfection. I am determined to exceed even her expectations." Mrs. Ross studied Clara's face, noting the determination mixed with something that might have been defiance. "There is more to this commission than professional pride," she observed. "What is the story behind your relationship with Mrs. Whitmore?" Clara hesitated, then decided that Mrs. Ross deserved to understand the situation. She wrote a brief explanation of her connection to the Whitmore family, watching her employer's expression shift from curiosity to outrage as she read. "That woman destroyed your wedding plans and now expects you to create a dress for her son's wedding to someone else?" Mrs. Ross exclaimed. "The audacity is breathtaking. You would be entirely justified in refusing the commission." "But then she would win," Clara wrote back. "She would continue believing that her judgment was correct, that I was indeed unsuitable for her family. By creating something beautiful for her, I proved that her loss was someone else's gain." Mrs. Ross nodded slowly, understanding dawning in her expression. "You are using your talent as a form of revenge," she said. "Not petty or cruel revenge, but the kind that demonstrates character and strength." Clara had not thought of her efforts in those terms, but she realized that Mrs. Ross had identified something important about her motivation. Every perfect stitch was indeed a form of vindication, a demonstration that worth could not be measured by social prejudices or family connections. The intensity of her work schedule left Clara little time for her usual evening visits to Thomas's farm, a change that did not go unnoticed by either of them. Thomas had taken to stopping by the seamstress shop each evening to walk Clara back to the inn, carrying oil lamps to light her path and ensuring she did not exhaust herself with overwork. "You are pushing yourself too hard," Thomas wrote one evening as they paused outside the inn. "This dress is important to you, but not at the expense of your health." Clara appreciated his concern, but she felt driven by something beyond simple professional pride. "I need to prove something," she wrote back, "not just to Mrs. Whitmore, but to myself. I need to know that I can create something truly exceptional when circumstances demand it." Thomas studied her response with a frown. "You have already proven your worth to everyone who matters," he wrote, "including yourself. Do not let this woman's past cruelty push you to dangerous extremes." His words carried weight because Clara knew they came from genuine care rather than casual concern. Thomas had been watching her transformation with growing admiration, but also with worry about the cost of her intense focus on perfection. The following Saturday brought the scheduled fitting appointment with Mrs. Whitmore. Clara had spent the previous evening making final adjustments to ensure the dress would fit perfectly, despite having to work from measurements rather than multiple fittings. When Mrs. Whitmore arrived at the shop precisely at 2 o'clock, Clara was ready with the nearly completed gown. Mrs. Whitmore's reaction to seeing the dress exceeded Clara's most optimistic expectations. The woman stood speechless for several moments, staring at the elaborate creation with obvious amazement. "This is extraordinary," Mrs. Whitmore finally managed. "I have never seen work of this quality, not even from the most expensive designers in Philadelphia." Clara helped Mrs. Whitmore into the dress, making minor adjustments to the fit, while noting with satisfaction that her measurements had been precisely accurate. The gown transformed Mrs. Whitmore's appearance, lending her an elegance and sophistication that her usual clothing, expensive though it was, had never achieved. "Where did you learn to embroider like this?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, studying her reflection in the shop's full-length mirror. "This technique is far beyond anything I've seen from American seamstresses." Clara wrote her response carefully. "My mother taught me traditional Irish methods passed down through generations of women in her family. I have spent years perfecting these techniques." Mrs. Whitmore read the note with growing interest. "Irish heritage," she mused. "That explains the exceptional quality. The Irish have always been known for their needlework skills." Clara felt a bitter irony in Mrs. Whitmore's praise for her Irish heritage. The same background that now impressed the woman as a mark of quality had been dismissed as inferior when it came to marriage prospects for her son. "I want to commission another dress from you," Mrs. Whitmore continued, still admiring her reflection. "Something for the Christmas social season in Philadelphia. Would you be willing to create something equally elaborate?" Clara wrote her acceptance, though she privately wondered if Mrs. Whitmore's attitude might change once she learned Clara's identity. For now, however, she would accept the commission and the validation it represented. The fitting concluded with Mrs. Whitmore's effusive praise and a promise to recommend Clara's services to her friends in Philadelphia society. Clara packed the dress carefully for the final week of finishing work, feeling a complex mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. That evening, Thomas found Clara in an unusually reflective mood when he arrived to escort her to the farm for their weekly garden inspection. The plants they had seeded together were now showing strong growth, with bean vines beginning to climb their supports and flower seedlings developing their first true leaves. "The garden is flourishing," Thomas wrote as they walked between the neat rows. "Like everything else you touch, it shows the benefit of your careful attention." Clara knelt to examine the young tomato plants, adjusting their supports and checking for signs of pest damage. "I have been thinking about what will happen when Mrs. Whitmore's dress is finished," she wrote. "Whether I should tell her who I am." Thomas joined her among the tomato plants, his expression thoughtful. "What would you hope to accomplish by revealing your identity?" he wrote. Clara considered the question carefully. "Perhaps nothing," she wrote finally, "but I think there might be some satisfaction in letting her know that the woman she deemed unworthy of her son created something she could never afford to reject." "And what if her reaction is not what you hope?" Thomas wrote back. "What if knowing your identity diminishes her appreciation for your work?" Clara looked up from the plants to meet Thomas's eyes. "Then that would tell me everything I need to know about her character," she wrote, "and it would confirm that Jonathan was not worth the heartbreak I felt when he abandoned me." Thomas reached out to touch her face gently, a gesture that had become natural between them over the weeks of their growing intimacy. "Clara, You have already proven everything you need to prove. Your worth is not dependent on this woman's recognition or approval. I know that intellectually, Clara wrote, but I think I need to close this chapter of my life completely before I can fully embrace what comes next. Thomas understood the deeper meaning behind her words. Clara was preparing to put her past with Jonathan completely behind her, but she needed to feel that she had done so on her own terms, rather than simply accepting defeat. They spent the rest of the evening working together in the garden, a peaceful domestic routine that had become precious to both of them. Thomas had installed a bench near the flower bed, where they could sit and plan future improvements while watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Clara, Thomas wrote as they sat together in the gathering twilight, I have something important to ask you. Clara felt her pulse quicken at his serious tone. Over the weeks of their courtship, she had sensed Thomas building toward some significant declaration, though she had not pressed him about his intentions. I know we have only known each other for 2 months, Thomas continued, but I feel more certain about my feelings for you than I have ever felt about anything in my life. Clara's hand trembled slightly as she wrote her response. What are you asking me, Thomas? Thomas took a deep breath before writing his next words. I am asking if you would consider making this your permanent home, not just Millbrook, but this farm, this house, this life we have been building together. Clara stared at his words, feeling the weight of the moment. Thomas was proposing marriage without using the specific word, giving her the opportunity to respond without the pressure of a formal proposal that might demand an immediate answer. Are you asking me to marry you? She wrote directly. Thomas nodded, his expression vulnerable but determined. I am asking you to be my wife, my partner, the person who helps me turn this house into a home again. I love you, Clara, not just for the loneliness you have helped me overcome, but for the person you are and the future I can imagine building with you. Clara set down her pencil and looked around the garden they had created together, the house Thomas had been improving with. Her comfort in mind, the life they had been unconsciously building through their daily routines and shared dreams. Yes, she wrote finally, the single word carrying the weight of her complete commitment to their future together. Thomas's face lit up with joy so radiant that Clara felt tears spring to her eyes. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew. A simple gold ring set with a small emerald, obviously chosen with care and attention to her preferences. It belonged to my grandmother, Thomas wrote as he slipped the ring onto Clara's finger. My mother always said it should go to the woman I married, the one who would help me build a family legacy worthy of the ring's history. Clara looked at the ring on her finger, feeling the weight of tradition and expectation it carried. But more than that, she felt the love and hope that Thomas had invested in this moment, the faith he was placing in their ability to create something lasting together. When, she wrote, practical considerations beginning to surface alongside her emotional response. Whenever you are ready, Thomas replied. Tomorrow if you wish, or next year if you need more time. I'm willing to wait as long as necessary for you to feel certain about this decision. Clara considered the question seriously. She had learned enough about Thomas over the past 2 months to feel confident about his character and their compatibility. More importantly, she had discovered her own strength and independence in Millbrook, proving to herself that she was choosing marriage from a position of strength rather than desperation. After Mrs. Whitmore's dress is finished, she wrote, after I have closed that chapter of my life completely, then I will be ready to begin our marriage with no shadows from the past. Thomas nodded his understanding and acceptance of her timeline. Will you move to the farm then? He wrote. Or would you prefer to continue working with Mrs. Ross after we marry? Clara felt a warm glow at his assumption that her work would continue after marriage. Many men would have expected their wives to abandon professional pursuits, but Thomas, understood that her needlework was more than just employment to her. "I would like to continue working," she wrote, "but perhaps from a studio here at the farm. Mrs. Ross has mentioned that she might be interested in partnering with me to serve wealthy customers who prefer private fittings." Thomas's smile showed his pleasure at her plans. "We could convert the front parlor into your studio," he wrote. "It has excellent light and would be perfect for meeting with customers." As they made their way back to the house in the deepening darkness, Clara reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that morning, 2 months ago, when she had sat abandoned on the train depot bench. The woman who had been rejected for her deafness was now engaged to a man who valued her exactly as she was, preparing to build a life that would showcase her talents and independence. Mrs. Whitmore's dress, nearly complete, would serve as both the culmination of her professional achievements and the final gesture of vindication against those who had judged her unworthy. After that, she would be free to embrace her future with Thomas completely, building the kind of partnership she had always dreamed of but never dared to expect. The abandoned bride had become a woman who chose her own happiness, and that happiness was about to begin in earnest. 2 weeks later, Clara put the final stitch into Mrs. Whitmore's dress, a masterpiece that represented the pinnacle of her artistic achievement. The burgundy silk caught the morning light streaming through the shop windows, transforming the embroidered roses and grapevines into a garden of threads that seemed to breathe with life. Every bead was perfectly positioned, every stitch flawless. In its execution, Mrs. Ross stood beside Clara's work table, studying the completed gown with obvious awe. "I have been a seamstress for 30 years, she said softly, "and I have never seen anything to equal this. You have created something that belongs in a museum." Clara felt a deep satisfaction at the completion of her work, but more than that, she felt ready to close this chapter of her past. The dress represented everything she had learned about her own capabilities, everything she had overcome since arriving in Millbrook as an abandoned bride. Mrs. Whitmore arrived for the final fitting. At precisely 2 o'clock, accompanied by an elegant woman Clara did not recognize. The stranger's expensive clothing and confident bearing suggested someone of considerable social standing. "Mrs. Henderson," Mrs. Whitmore said, using the false name Clara had provided. "I have brought my dear friend, Mrs. Victoria Ashford, with me. She insisted on seeing your work after I described it to her." Mrs. Ashford examined the dress with the keen eye of someone accustomed to the finest craftsmanship. "Extraordinary," she murmured, running her fingers over the intricate beadwork. "This rivals anything I have seen from the royal workshops in Europe." Clara helped Mrs. Whitmore into the completed gown, making final adjustments to the drape and fit. The transformation was remarkable. The dress elevated Mrs. Whitmore's appearance to a level of elegance she had never achieved before. "Perfect," Mrs. Whitmore declared, studying her reflection with obvious satisfaction. "Mrs. Henderson, you have exceeded every expectation. This dress will be the talk of Philadelphia society." Clara nodded her acknowledgement, then moved to her work table, where she had prepared an envelope containing her business card and a brief note. She had made a decision about revealing her identity, one that would allow her to close this chapter of her past with dignity rather than drama. "Mrs. Whitmore," Clara wrote on a piece of paper, "before you leave, there is something I would like you to know about the woman who created your dress." Mrs. Whitmore read the note with curiosity, then accepted the envelope Clara offered. Inside was Clara's real business card, clearly identifying her as Clara May Henderson of Cedar Falls, Minnesota, along with a brief note. "I am the woman who was engaged to marry your son Jonathan last month. You deem me unsuitable for your family without ever meeting me. I hope this dress demonstrates that worth cannot be measured by prejudice or social assumptions. I wish you joy in your son's wedding. Clara Henderson. Mrs. Whitmore's face went through a series of expressions as she read confusion, recognition, shock, and finally something that might have been shame. She looked up at Clara with new eyes, seeing for the first time the woman she had rejected sight unseen. "You are—" Mrs. Whitmore began, then stopped, apparently speechless. Clara wrote another note. "I am the deaf woman you believed would embarrass your family. The same woman who just created the most beautiful dress you have ever owned." Mrs. Ashford, who had been listening to this exchange with growing interest, stepped forward. "May I see that note?" she asked Mrs. Whitmore. After reading Clara's explanation, Mrs. Ashford turned to study Clara with obvious admiration. "My dear," she said, speaking clearly so Clara could read her lips, "you have handled this situation with remarkable grace. Mrs. Whitmore, I believe you owe this young woman an apology." Mrs. Whitmore struggled visibly with her emotions, pride warring with recognition of her mistake. Finally, she spoke directly to Clara. "Miss Henderson, I was wrong about you. Terribly wrong. Your work speaks to a character and talent that I failed to recognize." Clara wrote her response. "Thank you. That acknowledgement means more to me than you know. Is there anything I can do to make amends for the pain I caused?" Mrs. Whitmore asked, her voice subdued. Clara smiled as she wrote her final message to Jonathan's mother. "You can remember that worth comes in many forms, and that judging people by their limitations rather than their abilities is a mistake that costs everyone involved." Mrs. Ashford nodded approvingly. "Wise words," she said. "Mrs. Whitmore, I hope you will remember this lesson in the future." After the two women left the shop, Clara felt a profound sense of closure. She had not sought revenge or dramatic confrontation, but had instead chosen to demonstrate her worth through excellence and dignity. The chapter of her life that had begun with Jonathan's betrayal was finally truly closed. Thomas was waiting outside the shop when Clara emerged, and she could see in his face that he understood the significance of this moment. She had told him about her decision to reveal her identity to Mrs. Whitmore, and he had supported her choice while making it clear that his opinion of her worth was not dependent on anyone else's recognition. "How do you feel?" Thomas wrote on his slate. "Free," Clara replied in her notebook. "Finally, completely free." They walked together to Reverend Harwood's house, where they had an appointment to discuss their wedding ceremony. Clara had decided that she wanted to marry Thomas as soon as possible, now that the last shadow from her past had been resolved. Reverend Harwood welcomed them warmly, his face lighting up when they explained their intention to marry. "I have been hoping for this news," he said. "You two have found something precious together, and I would be honored to perform your ceremony." They discussed the details. A simple ceremony the following Saturday, with Mrs. Ross, Mrs. Walsh, and a few of Thomas's neighbors as witnesses. Clara had written to her parents about her engagement, and their response had been one of joy and relief that their daughter had found happiness and security with a good man. The week leading up to their wedding passed in a blur of final preparations. Clara gave notice to Mrs. Ross, though they agreed that she would continue taking special commissions from her new studio at the farm. Thomas made final improvements to the farmhouse, transforming the front parlor into the workroom Clara would need for her professional projects. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright, perfect weather for a wedding. Clara dressed in a simple cream-colored dress she had made herself, adorned with subtle embroidery that showcased her skills without overwhelming the garment's elegant simplicity. The ceremony took place in the small church, where Clara had first met Reverend Harwood, with sunlight streaming through the clear windows to illuminate the simple wooden altar. Thomas wore his best suit, and his face glowed with happiness as Clara walked down the short aisle to join him. Reverend Harwood had adapted the ceremony to accommodate Clara's deafness, speaking clearly and providing written copies of the vows so she could follow along perfectly. When the time came for them to exchange rings, Thomas's hands were steady as he placed his grandmother's wedding band alongside the engagement ring on Clara's finger. "You may kiss your bride," Reverend Harwood announced, and Thomas lifted Clara's veil with gentle hands before kissing her softly. As they walked back down the aisle as husband and wife, Clara reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. The woman who had been abandoned at the train depot had become someone stronger, more confident, and more capable of recognizing true love when she found it. The wedding celebration was held at the farm, where Mrs. Walsh had prepared a feast using vegetables from the garden Clara and Thomas had planted together. As the sun set over the fields Thomas's family had worked for generations, Clara stood beside her new husband and felt a contentment she had never imagined possible. "Any regrets?" Thomas wrote on the slate they still used for private communication. Clara looked around at the home they would share, the garden they had created together, the friends who had gathered to celebrate their marriage. "Only that it took me so long to find you," she wrote back. Thomas smiled and pulled her close, and Clara understood that her real life, the life she was meant to live, was just beginning. The abandoned bride had become a cherished wife, and her silence had finally found its perfect match in a man who understood that the deepest communications require no words at all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.